April Marie Tinsley. On the afternoon of April 1st, 1988, an 8-year-old second grader from Fort Wayne, Indiana, vanished while retrieving her umbrella during playtime with friends. April Marie Tinsley was known in her community for her involvement in her church choir and playful spirit. The day she disappeared was Good Friday, and what began as a search for a missing person would evolve into one of the most disturbing cold cases in Indiana history. The person responsible, John D. Miller, lived a reclusive existence in Grabille, Indiana. Miller lured April into his blue pickup truck, drove her to his trailer, and ended her life before disposing of her body in a rural ditch near Spencerville. Her body was discovered on April 4th, with an autopsy confirming the cause and revealing evidence of an attack. One shoe and other items were left at the scene. Miller's actions extended beyond the initial crime. In 1990, he scrawled a message on a barn with crayons that boasted about what he had done and threatened to act again. 14 years later, in 2004, he escalated his taunting behavior. 4 notes were left in plastic bags along with used condoms and Polaroid photographs on bicycles and a mailbox around Fort Wayne. One note read, "Hi, honey. I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and raped and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim." DNA, extracted from the condoms, matched the profile from the original crime scene. But investigators lacked a suspect to compare it against. The FBI developed a profile describing the perpetrator as a local, low-income individual in his 40s to 50s. Despite these insights and the physical evidence, the case remained unsolved for 3 decades. The turning point arrived in 2018 through genetic genealogy. Detectives partnered with Parabon Nanolabs and uploaded the DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database. This approach identified relatives of the unknown perpetrator, allowing investigators to narrow their search to Miller and his brother. Surveillance of Miller's residence led to the collection of trash samples, and DNA from discarded condoms provided the definitive match. When arrested on July 15, 2018, Miller immediately said April's name and confessed to investigators. He admitted to his actions and explained that he had planned to take someone that day, though April had not been specifically targeted. Miller pleaded guilty and received an 80-year sentence. 50 years for the taking of life and 30 years for additional charges. His earliest possible release date would have been 2058. Miller died of natural causes in prison on September 4, 2025, at age 66. April's mother spoke of waiting 30 years for answers, while Miller's own brother disowned him, stating he deserved whatever punishment he received. Police Chief Steve Reed noted family's 3-decade wait, and Sergeant Ron Galaviz remarked on the closure finally achieved. The shocking element of this resolution lay in how Miller had lived quietly in the same community for decades while periodically taunting authorities, only to be identified through emerging genetic genealogy technology that connected DNA evidence to his distant relatives. What happened to a Texas cheerleader one February night would remain a mystery even longer. Carla Walker. On the evening of February 17, 1974, 17-year-old Carla John Walker attended a Valentine's dance at her high school in Fort Worth, Texas. Walker was a cheerleader at Western Hills High School, known among her peers and community. After the dance, she and her boyfriend Rodney McCoy stopped at a bowling alley parking lot. What occurred next would haunt Fort Worth for 46 years. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., then 31 years old and working as a truck driver, approached McCoy's vehicle. He struck McCoy unconscious and forcibly removed Walker from the car. During the attack, McCurley dropped a magazine from a .22 Ruger pistol at the scene, a detail that would become significant decades later. Over the following 2 days, Walker endured sustained harm before her life was taken. McCurley administered morphine to subdue her during this period. Her body was discovered in a culvert near Lake Benbrook, and the autopsy confirmed she had been alive following her abduction. The medical examination revealed evidence of the prolonged nature of her ordeal. The investigation in 1974 pursued multiple leads, but McCurley passed a polygraph examination, which diverted suspicion away from him. When questioned about the magazine found at the scene, he claimed the weapon had been taken from him. The case grew cold as conventional investigative techniques reached their limits. Investigators suspected connections to other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s in the Fort Worth area, though no additional charges were ever filed. The motive appeared to be random and opportunistic, driven by opportunity rather than any prior connection to Walker. The breakthrough came 46 years after Walker's disappearance. In 2020, Othram Inc., a forensic laboratory, analyzed degraded DNA samples from Walker's clothing. The testing was funded by Oxygen Network's The DNA of Murder series. Despite the age and condition of the evidence, scientists successfully developed a DNA profile suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. This profile was used to identify family members, ultimately leading investigators to McCurley. Trash samples collected from his residence, along with a cheek swab, confirmed the match to DNA evidence from 1974. McCurley was arrested in September 2020 at age 77 and charged with capital offense. During his 2021 trial, prosecutors presented evidence, including the .22 Ruger that McCurley had kept hidden for decades. Midway through the proceedings, he changed his plea to guilty and received a life sentence without the possibility of release. In a statement to a reporter, McCurley said he had had enough hounding. He died in prison in July 2023. Walker's family expressed gratitude for the technology that finally provided answers, though they lamented the decades of delayed justice. The case inspired the Walker Act, which provides federal funding for forensic genealogy in cold cases. The shocking revelation that Walker had endured days of captivity and that her assailant had lived freely for nearly half a century underscored both the tragedy and the transformative power of genetic science. But DNA technology would prove capable of solving cases with even more challenging evidence. Stephanie Isaacson. On the evening of November 1, 1989, 25-year-old Stephanie Isaacson was at home in her apartment in Vancouver, Washington. Isaacson worked as a dental assistant and lived alone. That night, someone entered her residence and attacked her. She was found deceased the following morning by a co-worker who had become concerned when Isaacson failed to arrive at work. The crime scene investigation revealed evidence of a violent encounter. Isaacson had been harmed in her own bedroom, and forensic examiners collected biological evidence from her clothing. However, the DNA technology available in 1989 was rudimentary compared to modern standards, and the case quickly went cold. Investigators suspected a connection to an earlier incident involving Melody Vanderberg in 1986, which had occurred in the same Vancouver area. The similarities in the circumstances and methods suggested a potential link, but without the ability to match DNA profiles, the connection remained speculative. For 3 decades, the evidence sat in storage while forensic science advanced. The DNA sample collected from Isaacson's clothing was minimal and degraded, measuring just 0.12 nanograms, an amount considered insufficient for traditional DNA analysis methods. Most laboratories would have deemed such a sample too small to work with. The breakthrough came when the Vancouver Police Department partnered with Othram Inc., a laboratory specializing in forensic genome sequencing. Using advanced techniques developed in the 2010s, Othram scientists were able to extract and sequence DNA from the minuscule sample. This represented a record low amount of DNA, successfully used to develop a complete genetic profile. The resulting profile was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, where it matched relatives of a man named Darren Roy Marchand. Investigators learned that Marchand had been of French-Canadian descent, which aided in the genealogical research process by narrowing the family tree search. As detectives compiled information about Marchand, they discovered a troubling pattern. He had been the prime suspect in the 1986 Melody Vanderburg case, confirming the earlier suspicion of a connection. The evidence now strongly suggested Marchand had been responsible for both incidents. However, justice in the traditional sense would be impossible. Marchand had taken his own life in 1995 at the age of 31, just 6 years after Isaacson's demise. He died without ever being charged or questioned about either case. Details about Marchand's background and personal life remained limited, but the pattern of his suspected activities indicated a progression of increasingly serious behavior. The resolution of Isaacson's case in 2019, 30 years after her passing, demonstrated the extraordinary advances in forensic DNA technology. The ability to generate a complete genetic profile from 0.12 nanograms of degraded DNA represented a significant milestone in forensic science, opening possibilities for thousands of other cold cases with similarly minimal evidence. For Isaacson's family, the identification of Marchand provided answers, but no courtroom proceedings or formal admission of responsibility. The next case would involve not a single incident, but a sprawling series of attacks across California. Janelle Lisa Cruz. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, California was terrorized by an unknown assailant who committed a series of attacks across multiple counties. The perpetrator was variously known as the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and later, the Golden State Killer. His pattern involved breaking into homes, often targeting couples, and committing terrible acts before vanishing into the night. On May 1, 1986, 18-year-old Janelle Lisa Cruz was at home alone in Irvine, California. Cruz was house-sitting for the Harrington family while they were away. That night, the perpetrator entered the residence and attacked Cruz, who was beaten and harmed before her life was taken. Her body was discovered the following morning. Cruz would become known as the final confirmed victim in what would be revealed as a series of 13 ending-of-life cases and more than 50 other serious offenses spanning from 1975 to 1986. The attacks had occurred across Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Clara, Orange, and Ventura counties, creating jurisdictional challenges for investigators who initially didn't realize they were pursuing the same person. The perpetrator displayed disturbing patterns of behavior. He would surveil homes before striking, often targeted couples, and sometimes made phone calls to victims or investigators afterward. During some attacks, he mentioned someone named Bonnie, and investigators later learned this referred to an ex-fiancée. His crimes showed both planning and rage, with evidence of careful preparation followed by explosive action. DNA evidence was collected from multiple crime scenes, and by the late 1990s, investigators had confirmed through genetic testing that the same individual was responsible for crimes attributed to both the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. However, the profile matched no one in law enforcement databases, and the case remained unsolved as years stretched into decades. The breakthrough arrived in April 2018 through an innovative application of genetic genealogy. Investigators partnered with forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter and uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database. This led them to distant relatives of the perpetrator, and genealogists constructed family trees that ultimately pointed to Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo was a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California. He had served as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn during the 1970s, but had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting. He had also served in the Navy during the Vietnam War as a damage controlman. D'Angelo was married with 3 daughters who were unaware of his other activities. Investigators conducted surveillance and collected discarded items from D'Angelo's residence. DNA from his car door handle and trash confirmed the match. He was arrested on April 24, 2018. During initial interactions with authorities, D'Angelo would speak in different voices, including one he called Jerry, through which he made statements about his actions. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of ending life and multiple other offenses, receiving life imprisonment without the possibility of release to avoid the possibility of capital punishment. In November 2025, a book by the prosecutor detailed additional aspects of the case, providing further insights into the investigation and D'Angelo's psychology. He remains incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison in protective custody at age 80. Cruz's family and the families of other victims attended D'Angelo's sentencing hearings, where many delivered impact statements. The resolution brought closure to dozens of families who had waited decades for answers. Though the knowledge that D'Angelo had lived freely for over 30 years after his last known offense remained difficult to accept. While D'Angelo's capture represented a massive investigative success, another case would reveal how perpetrators sometimes inadvertently provided the very evidence that would lead to their identification. Anna Jean Kane. On the afternoon of March 21, 1988, 39-year-old Anna Jean Kane was found deceased in her home in Hamburg, Pennsylvania. Kane was a mother who lived in the small Berks County community. Her body was discovered by family members who had become concerned when she didn't respond to attempts to contact her. The crime scene investigation revealed evidence of a violent encounter. Kane had been harmed in her own residence, and investigators collected biological evidence from items at the scene. However, despite extensive investigation and interviews with potential suspects, the case went cold. No clear motive emerged, and without DNA databases or advanced forensic genealogy, investigators had few avenues to pursue. Then, in 1990, something extraordinary occurred. An anonymous letter arrived at the Reading Eagle newspaper containing details about Kane's demise that only the perpetrator would know. The letter was boastful in tone and appeared designed to taunt investigators. The sender had sealed the envelope and, importantly, had licked the seal, leaving behind saliva. Investigators preserved this letter as evidence, recognizing its potential value. The details contained within it confirmed that the author had direct knowledge of the incident, but without the ability to extract and analyze DNA from the minimal saliva sample. The letter couldn't immediately lead to an identification. Decades passed with no new developments. The letter sat in evidence storage while forensic science progressed. By the 2010s, techniques had advanced sufficiently to extract DNA from even minute biological samples like the saliva residue on an envelope seal. In the early 2020s, the Pennsylvania State Police decided to revisit Kane's case using modern genetic genealogy techniques. They sent the letter to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Scientists successfully extracted DNA from the envelope and developed a genetic profile. This profile was then compared to genetic information in genealogy databases, leading investigators to a family tree that included a man named Scott Grimm. Grimm was a native of Hamburg, the same small community where Kane had lived and died. Investigators discovered that Grimm had a history of harassment, including sending disturbing letters to others. He had been arrested in 2002 for similar behavior. When the DNA from the anonymous letter was compared to DNA collected from Kane's clothing in 1988, it matched. However, Grimm had died in 2018 of natural causes at age 58, 4 years before he was identified as Kane's attacker. He had lived his entire life in the Hamburg area, never moving away from the scene of his crime. Investigators found no evidence of a prior connection between Grimm and Kane, suggesting the attack was random rather than targeted. The psychological profile that emerged suggested traits consistent with a need for attention and recognition. The act of sending a boastful letter to a newspaper, combined with Grimm's later pattern of harassing correspondence, indicated someone who wanted his actions acknowledged, even if his identity remained hidden. The resolution of Kane's case in 2022, 34 years after her passing, provided her family with answers they had waited decades to receive. The identification came from genetic genealogy analysis of the very letter Grimm had sent in an apparent attempt to taunt investigators, his own arrogance becoming the tool of his eventual identification. Sometimes the perpetrator was even closer than anyone imagined. Nancy Marie Benelak. On October 28, 1970, 27-year-old Nancy Marie Benelak returned home to her apartment in Sacramento, California. Benelak worked as a legal secretary and lived alone in an apartment building. That evening, she was attacked in her own home with a knife from her kitchen, sustaining multiple wounds before her life was taken. When Benelak's body was discovered the following morning by a colleague who had arrived to carpool to work, the crime scene revealed a brutal encounter. Benelak had fought back against her attacker, evidenced by defensive injuries. The medical examination confirmed she had sustained stab wounds, and the weapon used was one of her own kitchen knives. What made this case particularly significant from a forensic standpoint was the blood evidence. Investigators found a blood trail that included the perpetrator's own blood mixed with the victim's. The attacker had been injured during the struggle, likely cut by the same knife. This biological evidence would prove crucial decades later. The initial investigation in 1970 pursued conventional leads. Detectives interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have had contact with Benelak. They examined her personal relationships and professional connections. However, without DNA technology or genetic databases, the case eventually went cold despite the presence of the perpetrator's blood at the scene. The evidence was preserved and stored as forensic science advanced through the decades. By the 2010s, DNA extraction and analysis techniques had progressed to the point where even decades-old dried blood samples could yield usable genetic profiles. In 2019, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance to fund genetic genealogy work on cold cases. Benelak's case was selected as a priority for this new approach. The blood evidence collected in 1970 was sent to a forensic laboratory for DNA extraction and analysis. Scientists successfully developed a DNA profile from the perpetrator's blood and uploaded it to genetic genealogy databases. The profile matched relatives of a man named Richard John Davis. As investigators built out the family tree and narrowed their focus, they made a stunning discovery. Davis had been Benelak's neighbor in the same apartment building. Further investigation revealed that Davis had lived in the building at the time of Benelak's demise. He had likely encountered her in common areas, perhaps on stairs or in hallways. Investigators found no evidence of any prior relationship between them, suggesting the attack was opportunistic rather than premeditated. Davis had no known history of similar behavior prior to 1970. However, Davis had died in 1997 from complications related to alcoholism, 22 years before he was identified. He had lived for 27 years after Benelak's demise without ever being connected to the incident. The resolution came when DNA from Davis's relatives confirmed the familial match. In 2020, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office announced that genetic genealogy had definitively identified Davis as Benelak's attacker, closing a 50-year-old cold case. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The proximity between victim and perpetrator would prove to be a recurring pattern in these cases. Rita Curran. On the evening of July 20th, 1971, 24-year-old Rita Curran returned to her apartment in Burlington, Vermont. Curran worked both as a teacher and as a motel maid, maintaining a busy schedule that kept her engaged in her community. She lived in a multi-unit building where she knew her neighbors by sight and occasionally exchanged pleasantries in the hallways and stairwells. That night, someone entered her apartment and attacked her. Curran fought back fiercely against her assailant, evidenced by the defensive injuries documented during the medical examination. She was beaten and ultimately lost her life to suffocation. The scene revealed signs of a violent struggle, with displaced furniture and other indicators that Curran had resisted her attacker with considerable determination. The investigation in 1971 focused on interviewing building residents and anyone who had contact with Curran in the days leading up to her passing. Among those questioned was William DeRose, who lived in the apartment directly above Curran's unit. DeRose provided investigators with an alibi, stating he had been with his wife at the time of the incident. His wife corroborated this account, and without evidence to contradict their statements, investigators moved on to other leads. Physical evidence was collected from the scene, including cigarette butts found in the apartment. However, DNA analysis did not exist in 1971, and these items were simply cataloged and stored as part of the case file. As months passed without a breakthrough, the case grew cold. DeRose and his wife separated not long after Curran's demise. He left Burlington and eventually relocated to Thailand, where he became a monk. His life took an unexpected trajectory that seemed far removed from the violence that had occurred in Burlington. In 1986, DeRose died from an overdose at the age of 43. Decades later, advances in forensic DNA technology prompted Burlington police to revisit cold cases from the 1970s. In 2014, the cigarette butts from Curran's apartment were sent for DNA testing. Scientists successfully extracted DNA and developed a profile of an unknown male. By 2019, genetic genealogy had become a viable investigative tool. The DNA profile from the cigarette butts was uploaded to genealogy databases, leading to matches with relatives of DeRose. Investigators built a family tree and narrowed their focus to William DeRose as the likely source of the DNA. Confirmation came through a DNA sample from DeRose's half-brother, which established a familial match. Further investigation into DeRose's background revealed troubling details. He had a documented history of unpredictable outbursts. In one incident, he had stabbed a friend without apparent provocation. In another, he had attempted to harm his wife by choking her. His former spouse later told investigators that DeRose had a tendency toward aggression that would emerge suddenly and without warning. The timeline suggested that on the night of Curran's passing, DeRose had argued with his wife before leaving their apartment. He went downstairs to Curran's unit, where the fatal encounter occurred. His wife's false alibi had shielded him from suspicion in 1971, allowing him to escape detection entirely. In February 2023, Burlington police announced that genetic genealogy had definitively identified DeRose as Curran's attacker. Curran's sister, Mary Campbell, praised the compassion shown by investigators over the decades, while her brother Tom spoke of their close-knit family. Another case would involve evidence collected during a wellness check. Laura Kempton. On the evening of September 27, 1981, 23-year-old Laura Kempton spent time socializing in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Kempton was a beauty school student building a career in cosmetology. She was last seen entering her apartment alone later that night, with witnesses confirming she appeared to be in good spirits and showed no signs of concern. The following afternoon, September 28th, a local officer arrived at Kempton's apartment to serve a summons for an unrelated civil matter. When there was no response at the door, the officer entered the apartment to conduct a welfare check. Inside, he discovered Kempton's body. She had been struck with a heavy object, and examination revealed she had sustained significant trauma. Cords were found around her ankles and neck, indicating her attacker had used materials found in the residence. The crime scene suggested a break-in motivated by opportunity. There were no signs that Kempton had known her attacker or had invited anyone into her apartment that evening. Investigators theorized the incident had a concerning motivation based on the circumstances. Though the perpetrator had left no identification and appeared to have targeted Kempton randomly. A glass bottle was recovered from the scene and believed to be the weapon used. Biological evidence was also collected. But DNA technology in 1981 was not advanced enough to develop a usable profile. The case grew cold as traditional investigative methods exhausted their potential. For 4 decades, Kempton's family waited for answers while forensic science evolved. By the early 2020s, techniques had advanced to the point where even degraded samples from decades-old crimes could yield DNA profiles suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. In 2022, the New Hampshire Department of Justice partnered with a forensic genealogy laboratory to analyze evidence from Kempton's case. Scientists developed a DNA profile from biological material collected at the scene and uploaded it to genealogy databases. The profile matched relatives of a man named Ronnie James Lee. Lee had been 21 years old in 1981 and was an Army veteran who worked in Portsmouth. Background checks revealed he had an extensive record of prior offenses, though nothing connecting him directly to Kempton. Investigators also located a cigarette butt from the original evidence collection, and DNA extracted from it matched the profile developed from other scene evidence. However, Lee had died in 2005 from a substance-related incident at the age of 45. He had lived for 24 years after Kempton's passing without ever being connected to the incident. The genetic genealogy match through his relatives posthumously established his responsibility. In July 2023, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella announced the resolution of Kempton's case, describing it as a bittersweet moment that brought closure after 42 years. The discovery of Kempton by an officer conducting a routine check, and the decades that passed before science could identify her attacker, highlighted both the tragedy of the case and the persistence of investigators. The next case would achieve a remarkable dual breakthrough in forensic genealogy. Mary Edith Silvani. On July 17, 1982, the body of an unidentified woman was discovered near Sheep's Flat, close to Lake Tahoe in California. The woman had been attacked and shot, and her remains were left in a remote location. The victim carried no identification, and despite efforts to match her to missing person reports, her identity remained unknown. She was cataloged as a Jane Doe, one of thousands of unidentified individuals in forensic databases across the country. Fingerprints taken from the body in 1982 were preserved in records, but they matched no one in existing databases. Without a name or any leads regarding her identity, the case presented a dual mystery. Who was she? And who had taken her life? The woman remained unidentified for 36 years. During this time, advances in DNA technology and the emergence of genetic genealogy as an investigative tool opened new possibilities for cases involving unidentified remains. In 2018, the DNA Doe Project, an organization dedicated to identifying unknown deceased individuals, took on the case. Using DNA extracted from the preserved remains and comparing it to genetic information in public genealogy databases, volunteers built family trees and eventually identified the Jane Doe. She was Mary Edith Silvani, who had been 33 years old at the time of her passing. Silvani had experienced significant hardship in her life, including family tragedies that left her without stable housing. By 1982, she was living without a permanent residence and had become disconnected from relatives who might have reported her missing. This explained why her disappearance had not been formally documented in databases that investigators could access. With Silvani finally identified, attention turned to solving the second part of the mystery. Who was responsible for her demise? Forensic evidence collected from her body in 1982 included DNA that belonged to an unknown male. This profile was analyzed using the same genetic genealogy techniques that had identified Silvani herself. The DNA profile led investigators to James Richard Curry, a man with a documented history of serious offenses. Curry had been from Texas and had prior convictions, including robbery. More significantly, he had been linked to other similar incidents before Silvani's demise. Before his own passing in 1983, Curry had confessed to additional attacks, confirming a pattern of predatory behavior. Curry had taken his own life while in custody in 1983, just 1 year after Silvani's passing, and long before he could be connected to her case. His death meant that traditional justice was impossible. But the genetic genealogy analysis provided definitive answers about his involvement. The resolution of Silvani's case represented a historic first. It was the initial instance of forensic genetic genealogy being used to identify both an unknown victim and their perpetrator. The dual identification demonstrated the expanding capabilities of this technology and its potential to resolve even the most challenging cold cases. The work was completed by Identifinders International, a genealogy firm specializing in forensic applications. For 37 years, Silvani had been a nameless victim in a forgotten case. The identification gave her back her name and connected her to family members who had lost track of her decades earlier. While Curry escaped earthly accountability, the scientific breakthrough ensured that both their identities would be recorded in the final resolution of the case. A case in Texas would reveal how quickly a perpetrator could escalate to even more devastating acts. Terry McAdams. On the evening of February 14, 1985, 22-year-old Terry McAdams was at her fiancé's apartment in Arlington, Texas. McAdams was a student at the University of Texas at Arlington, working toward her degree while planning her upcoming wedding. Her fiancé was away that Valentine's evening, leaving McAdams alone in the residence. Someone entered the apartment through an unlocked sliding glass door, a common point of entry in many residential buildings of that era. McAdams was attacked, beaten, and her life was taken. The scene indicated a violent encounter, and forensic examiners collected biological evidence that would prove crucial decades later. The investigation in 1985 pursued multiple leads. McAdams had no known conflicts or disputes that might explain such an attack. The circumstances suggested an opportunistic entry by someone who had observed the apartment and waited for a moment when the occupant was alone and vulnerable. However, without DNA technology widely available for criminal investigations in the mid-1980s, the case eventually went cold. Evidence from the scene was preserved according to protocols of the time, and the case file remained open but inactive as years passed. Detectives continued to review the case periodically, but without new leads or forensic breakthroughs, progress remained elusive. The advancement of forensic genetic genealogy in the 2010s offered new possibilities for cold cases with preserved biological evidence. In 2023, the Arlington Police Department partnered with the FBI to apply genetic genealogy techniques to McAdams's case. DNA extracted from evidence at the scene was analyzed and uploaded to genealogy databases. The profile matched relatives of a man named Bernard Sharp. Sharp had been living in the vicinity of the apartment complex in 1985 and had a documented history as a registered offender. His background suggested a pattern of concerning behavior, and the proximity to McAdams's residence provided the opportunity for the opportunistic attack that investigators had long theorized. However, Sharp would never face charges for McAdams's demise. In November 1985, just 9 months after attacking McAdams, Sharp took the lives of his wife and a friend before taking his own life. This final act of destruction occurred before any connection could be made between Sharp and the Valentine's Day incident involving McAdams. The genetic genealogy analysis in 2023 definitively linked Sharp to McAdams through DNA evidence, closing the case nearly 40 years after it occurred. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones stated that detectives had never wavered in their commitment to finding answers, even across multiple generations of investigators. The revelation that Sharp had escalated from attacking McAdams to taking multiple lives just months later highlighted the dangerous progression that can occur when such individuals remain unidentified. For McAdams's family and her former fiancé, the resolution brought long-awaited answers about what had happened that Valentine's evening in 1985. In Wisconsin, investigators would discover that 2 separate incidents spanning 5 years shared a common perpetrator: Diane Olkwitz and Terry Erdman. On November 3, 1966, 19-year-old Diane Olkwitz arrived for her shift at the Kenworth Trucking Facility in Menomonee Falls, Wisconsin. Olkwitz worked as a secretary and was known as a warm and caring individual by her colleagues and family. When she failed to return home that evening, family members contacted authorities and a search of the facility was conducted. Olkwitz was found deceased inside the building, having sustained more than 100 stab wounds. The extensive nature of the attack suggested extreme rage or psychological disturbance on the part of the perpetrator. Medical examination confirmed that the attack had not included certain other elements, indicating the primary motive may have been tied to anger or opportunity rather than other factors. The investigation in 1966 identified no clear suspects. Olkwitz had no known conflicts, and co-workers reported nothing unusual in the days leading to her demise. The case grew cold despite the preservation of physical evidence from the scene. 5 years later, on June 24, 1971, the body of 15-year-old Terry Erdman was discovered in a field in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Erdman had been stabbed approximately 60 times, and her body had been partially disrobed. The brutality of the attack and certain circumstantial details led some investigators to wonder if there might be a connection to other unsolved cases, but without concrete evidence, this remained speculation. Both crime scenes were located within 2 miles of each other, though this proximity was not initially recognized as significant. The cases were investigated separately, and decades passed with both remaining unsolved. Families of both victims continued to seek answers as years stretched into decades. The breakthrough came in the 2020s through advances in DNA sequencing and genetic genealogy. In 2021, Othram, Inc. was able to extract and sequence DNA from evidence collected at both crime scenes decades earlier. The DNA from Olkwitz's case came from items at the scene, while Erdman's case yielded DNA from biological evidence on her body. Analysis revealed that the DNA profiles from both cases matched each other, confirming that the same person was responsible for both attacks. This was a significant development, linking two cases that had been investigated independently for more than 50 years. The combined profile was then uploaded to genealogy databases for familial matching. The genetic genealogy analysis, conducted with FBI assistance, identified relatives of a man named Clarence Marcus Tappendorf. Tappendorf had worked as a truck driver and was familiar with the areas where both incidents occurred. His occupation and local knowledge would have given him access to the Kenworth facility where Olkwitz worked and familiarity with the routes near where Erdman was found. Tappendorf had died in 2008 at the age of 80, never having been connected to either case during his lifetime. To confirm the genetic genealogy findings, authorities obtained court approval to exhume Tappendorf's remains. DNA extracted from his body definitively matched the profiles from both crime scenes. The announcement of the resolution came in 2023, more than 50 years after both incidents. Olkwitz's sister Debbie spoke of her sister's caring nature and the family's long wait for answers. The shocking revelation that the same person had committed both attacks, separated by 5 years and targeting victims of different ages and circumstances, raised questions about Tappendorf's activities during the years between and whether there might have been additional victims who were never connected to him. The final case would be resolved in the most dramatic fashion, involving a standoff that ended the perpetrator's life. Deborah Lee Miller. On the morning of April 29, 1981, 18-year-old Deborah Lee Miller was found deceased in her apartment in Mansfield, Ohio. Miller worked as a waitress and lived in a modest apartment building. She had been attacked with items from her own kitchen, including an oven grate and cooking pots, sustaining severe trauma before her life was taken. The crime scene suggested someone had entered Miller's apartment with harmful intent. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to theorize that Miller may have known her attacker, or that the perpetrator had gained access through an unlocked door. The brutality of the attack, using improvised weapons found in the residence, painted a picture of rage or opportunity, rather than premeditation. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with building residents, including James Van Est, who lived in the apartment directly above Miller's unit. Van Est provided statements about his whereabouts and claimed to have no knowledge of the incident. Without evidence to contradict his account and lacking DNA technology to analyze biological evidence from the scene, the case eventually went cold. Evidence was preserved according to 1981 protocols, and the case file remained open but inactive for decades. Periodic reviews by cold case detectives found no new leads using conventional investigative methods. By 2021, advances in DNA technology made it possible to analyze complex mixed profiles that would have been unusable in earlier decades. Forensic scientists were able to extract and separate multiple DNA profiles from evidence collected at Miller's apartment in 1981. One of these profiles belonged to an unknown male who was not Miller or any of the individuals who had been ruled out during the original investigation. This profile was suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. When uploaded to genealogy databases and analyzed, it led investigators back to James Van Est, the upstairs neighbor who had been interviewed 40 years earlier. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies between Van Est's 1981 statements and the physical evidence. In 2024, investigators approached Van Est for a follow-up interview. During this conversation, detectives presented him with information about the DNA evidence and the inconsistencies in his previous statements. Following this interview, Van Nest fled the area. On November 18, 2024, law enforcement located Van Nest and attempted to take him into custody. A standoff ensued during which an officer was wounded. The confrontation ended when Van Nest was fatally shot. His death occurred before he could be formally charged with Miller's demise, though the DNA evidence had definitively connected him to the crime scene. Detective Terry Butler stated that Van Nest likely sensed the investigation was closing in on him after the 2024 interview, prompting his flight and the eventual confrontation. Van Nest had also been facing unrelated federal charges at the time of his death, adding additional pressure. The resolution of Miller's case came 43 years after her passing. The revelation that her upstairs neighbor had been responsible all along, providing false information to investigators in 1981 and living in the same building where he had committed the offense, echoed patterns seen in other cases where proximity and opportunity had enabled perpetrators to remain undetected for decades. For Miller's family, the identification brought closure, but also the difficult knowledge that justice had come only through Van Nest's death rather than through trial and formal accountability. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.